There are many house plants that grow very easily and also can be propagated easily. So, if you buy one plant of a particular variety like Philodendron or Pothos or Syngonium, these are plants that grow very easily and look really beautiful. They are low maintenance and they can also be propagated easily. So, these are the nodes from which these plants are propagated. And once these are propagated, you can have so many of these in your garden. Hi everyone, and welcome to Fresh from My Garden. In today's video, I am sharing tips on how to propagate these plants that are commonly grown as house plants, and we have a few varieties of pothos, philodendrons and syngoniums. So these are plants that are low maintenance, they don't take up too much of space. They can be grown in hanging pots or small containers, and they grow really well if given a little bit of care. And also, if you like to fill your indoors with lots of plants, you can just take cuttings of these plants and propagate them and plant them into different containers. So, today I'm taking cuttings of the Philodendron Brazil and a few other varieties. In this video, I'll show you the difference between the water propagation method and the soil propagation method. So in the water propagation method, as you can see here, you just take cuttings at the nodes, just small leaf cuttings at the nodes, and you place them in a bottle or a glass of water for a few days until you see roots starting to form. Take care to change the water once every 2 or 3 days when you see that the water is starting to look a little dirty, or you see any sort of fungal formation or any pest formation in the water or in the plant. So, if you change them every 2 or 3 days, and if you see in a couple of weeks, you will start to see a lot of new root formation in these plants. So, once they are propagated and once they have a lot of root formation, then they can continue to grow inside a bottle or in a glass jar with water in it. But whenever you grow these plants in water, they are mostly used only for rooting purpose. And once the new roots have been formed, it is better to transplant them and pot them in soil. That is when they really grow well. In water, the growth is limited, and these plants will be very slow growing plants when grown in water when compared to growing in the soil. So now I have some of these cuttings that have been rotting in a glass jar and a glass of water for quite some time now. So here I have cuttings of philodendron and pothos and also syngonium. So once I remove this from the water, you can see that roots have started to form. You can see these long roots that have started to form. And usually, when the rooting is in the water, it's usually the roots are beautiful and white in color. So you can know the difference between the old root and the new roots. So once you take them out of the water, you can see all these roots that have started to form. And also, there might be signs of some part of the stem starting to rot. So you don't have to worry when you see that rotting, because since these stems have been in the water for a very long time, some part of it might have started to rot. So, in such a case, you can just cut it off using a pair of shears, and you can just trim off that part. Now, here I have taken cuttings of the neon pothos and planted it directly in the soil. So, these have also been in the soil for quite some time now. But as you can see, you can only see the nodes and no sign of root growth. So it is the same amount of time that I took cuttings and I placed some in the water and some directly in the soil. And here you can see the difference where the growth is or the rooting is slow. So, ideally, once these plants have rooted well in water, in order for them to grow well, they need to be potted in the soil. But when you're taking cuttings and placing them directly in the soil, the rooting is really slow. And here you can see a small, tiny root starting to develop, but it's still small when compared to the rooting of these cuttings that I had placed in water. So, this is the difference that I have experienced. You might have different experiences when it comes to taking cuttings and rooting these plants. But whenever I have directly taken cuttings and planted them in soil, it has taken a lot of time to develop roots when in comparison to these roots that have developed quickly in water. And this is also another plant that is a devil's ivy plant, and I have taken a cutting of that and directly placed it in the soil. It still hasn't developed any new roots. And today I am going to show you how to pot these plants that have rooted in water. So these are new roots that are starting to form from the cuttings that have been placed in water. Some roots have developed really well, some roots haven't developed so much, but they are still doing well. So now here you can see some rotting at the base of that cutting. So you don't have to worry about that. That rotting can be just removed by using a pair of cutting shears or pruners. So once that has been removed, then this can be potted into the containers. So I have two containers here in which I had planted the previous cuttings which had not developed any sort of root. So I'm going to be planting these ones that have developed a lot of roots in water into those containers. So this plant, the frog planter, had calatheas growing in it, and the calathea had died back. So I had planted few other cuttings, but now that the calathea has come back, I'm just going to let it sit there, and I'm going to plant few of these cuttings into it. So, as you can see, the roots that have developed in water have really developed well and they look really nice. And I'm going to trim off any of the excess rot rotting in the stem that has developed after staying in the water for a long time. So these can be easily trimmed off, and I'm going to just cut them off and remove it before planting it into the soil so that that rotting doesn't develop any sort of root disease for these plants. The soil in the containers in which I'm going to be planting has a mix of some coco peat along with garden soil and vermicompost. And into these planters, I'm going to plant these. So, when you're planting these cuttings into the soil, make sure that you don't directly push the stems into the soil because it can damage the roots and the stems, and this can cause breakage of the stem and the root, and then this plant will not grow. So, you can use a wooden stick or something sharp to poke a hole in the soil and make enough room for these plants stem and the root to go well into the soil. So many times, even something that I have done initially as a beginner is that I used to push the stems directly into the soil, and it can cause the stems or the roots to get damaged. It breaks, and then the plant just withers away very quickly and then it doesn't develop. So here As you can see, I am not planting just one variety in the container. I am planting a variety of pothos and philodendron as a mix and match into this container, and it also has a calathea which was already growing here. So this is a marble pothos and this is a variety of philodendron along with calathea. Now, here I have the cuttings that were growing or that were planted in the soil and it has not developed any roots. So, these will go back into those glass jars or containers, glass containers with water in them so that they can develop roots. And at a later period of time, I will be planting them directly into the soil once the roots have developed. So, now when you are planting these into the container, you don't have to particularly plant only the pothos or the philodendron into a container, since these plants have similar requirements when it comes to light and watering and soil. You can do a mix and match as I am doing here, and you can add more than two or three varieties of cuttings that have the same requirements. So here, since pothos, syngonium, philodendrons are all plants with the same kind of requirements, I'm going to add a combination of these into these two pots. Once these cuttings have been planted, let them sit in a shady spot for at least 4 to 5 days till it gets accustomed and adjusted to the new pot and environment. And once they have started developing new leaves, once you start seeing new leaf formation, and once they start getting a little bushier, you can bring them indoors if that is where you want to keep them, or you can change the spot and bring them to whichever spot you would like to place these pots. But until then, once these have been potted, make sure that they are not being disturbed too much and they can get used to the new atmosphere. Also, once you have planted these, water it lightly and make sure not to overwater it. Overwatering also after getting into a new pot can cause a lot of root rotting and disease related problems. Pothos, philodendrons, and syngoniums are plants that prefer more indirect light than direct harsh sunlight. So, these plants and the leaves can get burnt very quickly if they are placed in a spot with too much of direct sunlight. So, even if these pots are going to be placed outdoors, make sure that they are in a spot which gets partial shade and is these plants are protected from the afternoon sun, because the afternoon sun can cause these leaves to get burnt and these plants can die really quickly. Watering can be done once in 2 or 3 days based on the climatic conditions that you are living in. So, currently, we are having not so hot weather conditions. It's cooler these days, and we don't have a lot of sunlight. We have more cloudy days. So during that time, we don't have to really water these plants every single day. They can just be watered once every 2 or 3 days. Just check the soil with your finger to make sure that the soil is not wet or moist before you water them. Overwatering is one of the main reasons many plants get the root rot problem and die very quickly, and they also develop a lot of diseases very quickly. So make sure not to overwater any of your plants. So I'm going to be placing these containers that have just been potted in the north side of my garden, so it's going to receive a lot of shade during the afternoon. And these cuttings that I removed from the soil and that has not developed any sort of root will be placed in containers with some water for a couple of weeks till I see any sort of root development in them. And once the roots have developed well, as you saw with my previous cuttings, then these can be transplanted into the soil because it is in the soil where it grows well and develops lot of roots and nodes when compared to the water is mainly for just rooting the plant, and the growth will be very slow if it is constantly kept in water, and it can also start decaying. As you saw in some of my cuttings, there was a lot of rotting and decaying in the stems. So now that these cuttings have been potted, I'm going to let it sit and I'll share an update on this at a later time. And these cuttings that I took out of the soil, I'm going to be putting it back into a container of water so that they can start rooting. And I'll place these on my windowsill in the kitchen. I hope you liked today's video and the tips that I shared in today's video. So, if you have any of these varieties of plants in your garden and would like to get more of these for different parts of your garden or for your indoor living space, this is a very easy way to propagate more plants from one plant, get a lot of cuttings, and grow new plants for different parts of your garden and also to gift to friends and family. Please continue to watch my channel for more gardening related videos, and don't forget to support and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching Fresh from My Garden.